Harvard undergraduate, summa cum laude, concentration in psychology and social relations. Master's from the University of California, Los Angeles, clinical psychology, and continued on with PhD in clinical psychology with some concentration in quantitative psychology and psychophysiologic psychology. He's had over 20 honors, among which a fellowship in the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and numerous others, too many to mention in this short introduction. Editor of the Psychological Bulletin, associate editor of Development and Psychopathology, on another dozen editorial boards, including Child Neuropsychology and Child Development. Has over 100 publications in all the major journals. Has over 10 books, and he will talk to us about his latest book, Another Kind of Madness. Dr. Hinshaw is also has joined faculty at UC Berkeley, a professor of psychology and past chair of the Department of Psychology, and is the also here at UCSF is vice chair for child and adolescent psychiatry. Steve.
Thank you, John. You forgot a very important part of my training. I was a postdoc at UCSF Psychiatry Langley Porter for 2 years. And my first year, the chair of the department was Bob Wallerstein, and the second year was Sam Barandy. So we went from arch psychoanalysis to the neurophysiology of the slime mold, and I think we're finally getting integrated at UCSF these days. That's one of my goals. So here's what we're going to do. We don't have much time, so I'm going to do a few slides on what this concept of stigma is and what some of the research basis is for is mental health, our mental health issues continuing to receive stigma. We'll shift gears pretty quickly, and I'll present a family narrative, which is the subject of my book, Another Kind of Madness, in which stigma at societal levels and structural levels and personal levels and family levels played a huge role in my upbringing and my subsequent career development. We'll show a few pictures along the way of reading some passages from the book, and then end with a few points about what we might do to understand stigma and stigma reduction better. So without further ado, what is stigma? It's a Greek term. Most psychological and psychiatric terms are Greek. What does it literally mean? So back in the day, if you were at the marketplace, the Agora in Athens, might have been important for you to understand who had fought for Sparta or who was a former slave. Might not be immediately apparent. So a brand was burned into the arm or shoulder or neck of the individual in question, part of that stigmatized group, so that stigma was a literal physical brand. Most stigma today is much more psychological. Are there more modern physical stigmata? Hitler branded with numbers people in concentration camps, who of course included not only Jewish individuals, but those with gay and lesbian sexual orientation, and those with mental infirmities, disabilities, mental illnesses. Some countries in the 80s literally branded HIV positive individuals, so you'd know whom to stay away from. But most stigma today is psychological. Middle of the slide, there's a lot of groups that receive stigma. It's part of hierarchical societies. But just, we don't have much time to get into all the detail. One of the terms up there is kind of interesting, left-handedness. My sister, when we were growing up in Ohio, was left-handed, and our grandmother didn't want Sally to be left-handed, and that was a stigma. Today, if you're left-handed, it's clear that you have great spatial abilities and you go to MIT. So it's not a stigma at all, it's only a good thing. So as society changes and values change, formerly stigmatized attributes may not be as stigmatized. But quite depressingly, even with overt attitude measures, Likert scales, which are maybe easy to fake or be socially desirable on. The bottom three groups that you would want to be considered in, if you didn't want to receive stigma, would be, do you have a mental illness? Are you homeless and or do you abuse drugs? Those are the most stigmatized groups in modern society. And if we go into implicit or more unconscious stigma, we might be underestimating just how high those rates really might be. I wrote a book on this topic over 10 years ago now, Oxford Press, The Mark of Shame, and I chose for the cover art a painting by Hieronymus Bosch, The Extraction of the Stone of Madness, 1496. It's hanging in the Prado. Many of Bosch's paintings are hanging in the Prado. And the lights in here are not always perfect for viewing, but we can see that the surgeon's wearing a wizard hat, so we know there's a problem already, is operating, trephining, cutting a hole into the skull of the patient. The priest with the chalice is giving a blessing. What was thought to be the cause of mental illness in Holland in 1496? You had a stone in your head. So the painting, The Extraction of the Stone of Madness, was a depiction of the surgeon wizard removing the stone. Except if you look closely, over there, over here, it looks like two little white tufty things, perhaps rather than a rock, emerging from the patient's head. So if you read up, Bosch, a very satirical and esoteric painter, was actually painting that the surgeon wizard was removing a flower from the patient's head. What was the name for mental illness in Holland in 1496? You were called a tulip head. Tulips were the source of commerce, still are in the Netherlands. So in some ways, Bosch was saying if you remove the label, if you remove the tulip, maybe the mental illness will go away, which is a very modern question. Are labels, diagnostic labels, empowering? Are they social control? So anyway, a little background artistically on why I chose this very provocative painting. Let's go ahead. In 1950, two Berkeley psychologists and two Berkeley sociologists wrote a famous book called The Authoritarian Personality. The book was an attempt to understand why so many German citizens followed Hitler in the 30s and 40s. And the idea was, in keeping with the strong psychoanalytic tendencies of that era, that very repressive parenting, introjection, projection, against others, against repressive parenting, even repressed homosexual tendencies, might have been the undercurrent or undergirding of people who were strong stigmatizers or showed a lot of prejudice. There is a current bunch of research in social psychology about people with extreme bias and prejudice. But most social psychology today is antithetical to this. Stigma is normative. We all, just to do social cognition and navigate our social worlds, have to engage in some basic social processes like stereotyping. I'm a very progressive Berkeley and UCSF professor. I've never stereotyped anybody except Stanford professors because they wear red and they're a private school and they're elite. Now those are true, I think, at least the first two. But if you heard my tone of voice, it wasn't just the stereotype, it was prejudice. I'm not sure I like those Stanford people. So affect comes in. And no Stanford student, for gosh sakes, is ever going to take my course through concurrent enrollment at Berkeley, only Cal students. So now I might discriminate. So this is the social psychological triad of fairly normative social processes that might predict stigma as occurring in most individuals. Stigma includes stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination, but also if I stigmatize you because of the group you're in, that group status defines you. Your individuality is lost. Dehumanization is another necessary aspect of stigma. If we had more time, we'd get into that. So, we could talk a lot about social stigma, personal stigma. Here's two chalk talk slides to get us into two important concepts. 1954, Gordon Allport, The Nature of Prejudice, said, without using the term stigma, if a member of a group against which prejudice is formed has lived in that society and heard the campfire stories, or today has read the tweets, seen the Instagrams, pretty hard for that person not to understand what the stereotypes are. And it's inevitable that that person would engage in self-stigma or internalized stigma. Since '54, it's pretty clear that this is a likely but not inevitable process. Many members of oppressed groups have fairly good self-worth. Black power, gay pride, women's rights. If you form solidarity and have a group, maybe that's a hedge against this internalization of stigma. What does this have to do with mental illness? There are pretty reliable and valid scales now that measure how internalized stigma, how much you have, independent of your levels of anxiety or depression. And those high levels of internalized stigma predict two things pretty clearly. You don't get into treatment, or you drop out early if you do. And of course, this is the ultimate paradox. We don't have cures for mental health issues, but the effect sizes for most are in the range of, or better than, most treatments you get from your doctor for a physical illness. So the prevention of treatment, of course there's systems and structural issues too. Is there real parity? Do we have a national health insurance plan or not? But internalized stigma is a huge barrier for treatment. And the second is courtesy stigma. So Irving Goffman, I wish I'd met him. When I moved up to Berkeley, he had passed away a few years before, the eminent sociologist, never did a statistic in his life. He was a participant observer. This is the sociologist who admitted himself into St. Elizabeth's for 6 months back in the 50s, and on the basis of that experience formed the concept of a total institution, where your whole identity is lost. Cruised the gay bars in the Village 10 years before Stonewall. And he wrote a book in 1963 called Stigma, Notes on the Development of Spoiled Identity. You can go to Amazon and buy it for a quarter when the talk is over. It'll be some dog-eared paperback that an undergrad read decades ago. And in the few chapters, about 130 pages, everything about stigma is in that book. And one of the concepts, Goffman could be sardonic, he said, look, if society stigmatizes the member of an outcast group, it's only common courtesy that society would stigmatize anybody associated with that individual, like family members. And of course, it wasn't so long ago that there was a double whammy. Parents caused autism because they emotionally refrigerated their kids. And schizophrenic mothers caused schizophrenia. So not only were they the causal agents, but they were associated with the individual in question. Who else follows suit, if you will, into this courtesy stigma? Well, clinical psychologists, psychiatrists, developmental and behavioral pediatricians, because let's face it, we work with crazy people. We work with the lowest of the low, as Susan Fiske would have us believe, if you believe in her theory of stigma. So, still today, if you apply into clinical, it's not quite the cachet of neuroscience or cog-sci, although it's coming up. Is psychiatry the most favored residency among med students? Well, we can debate that. This is courtesy stigma. And if you believe NAMI, in the survey of 2,000 people that Otto Wall did back 15 years ago, and the interview follow-up of 100 of them, many people with schizophrenia, schizoaffective, and bipolar disorder will tell you that some of the biggest stigma they received is at the hands of their practitioners. Low expectations, much more overt in some cases, go home or get out of my emergency room, you don't have a real illness if you're using drugs or you hear voices. And so I think the courtesy stigma that our field gets may be imparted unnecessarily to the people we're trying to give care to. People in the United States know a lot more about schizophrenia, alcoholism, ADHD, autism, depression than in 1955. How do we know? The same vignettes have been used in national surveys for the last 60 years. So there's measurement invariance, which is rare. Why? Well, there's psychology courses in high schools. I don't think at my public school in Ohio they really knew that psychology had a silent P. There were certainly no courses. It's in the media everywhere. Knowledge has gone up. But attitudes, especially social distance, would you live in the same hemisphere as someone with ... ride the bus with, go to work with, let your daughter marry, go out with, have remained entirely flat. There's been no upward trend since '55. And in fact, 2.5 times more Americans today than in '55, if they hear the term mental illness, make an automatic association with violence. What's the public face of mental illness? Violent young men, deranged looking, who shoot. schools. And driving to UCSF most days, if I take one route versus another, the public face of mental illness is under the freeways in San Francisco and Oakland and Berkeley. We've closed the institutions down. The snake pits are hardly there anymore, but what level of community supports do we have in place? So, in contrast, if you look at the Pew Charitable Trust, they do great annual surveys on a lot of social issues. What percentage of Americans in 2001 were in favor of gay marriage? 38%. 2016, 62%. That's a huge 15-year trend. And if you look at their random cross-sectional data every year, it's driven every year by people under 25. So young people are starting to carry the day in changing national attitudes. Can we do the same for mental health stigma? If we have time at the end, I'll tell you about some of the high school clubs that we're starting, about 200 now in the state. Not therapy groups, but clubs where kids invent their own curriculum, so to speak, to combat stigma with themselves, their peers, teachers, and parents. So let's shift gears and talk much more personally about stigma. I'll read some passages. My book is called Another Kind of Madness. Why would I choose such a title for a book on mental health, families, and stigma? Isn't madness kind of an archaic, stigmatizing term? Well, I'll tell you why I chose that title. From the book's preface. The inspiration for the title is based on a quote from James Baldwin in one of his masterpieces, Giovanni's Room. People who remember court madness through pain, the pain of the perpetually recurring death of their innocence. People who forget court another kind of madness, the madness of the denial of pain and the hatred of innocence. And the world is mostly divided between madmen who remember and madmen who forget. Ever hear a sentence like that? Baldwin was an incredible stylist with his prose. Of course, I cannot claim to comprehend Baldwin's personal experiences fully, but his words are inspirational. Regarding the present narrative, as I try to make clear, stigma itself is another kind of madness, a form with consequences that are far worse than those linked to any form of mental illness itself. More broadly, stigma fosters a denial of human potential. The silence and shame must be transformed into open dialogue. Unless we make progress toward this goal, we will never realize whom we can become as a species. ADHD's got a lot of impairments. So does autism spectrum disorders, that whole range. Schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, PTSD. Those are forms of psychiatric disorder, mental disorder, whatever your choice of terms is. But what's madness is when you can't talk about it and people don't get the treatment they need. So this is another kind of madness. Where does this narrative start? Well, with any family saga, you could go back many generations, but we'll start in the 30s, down the road in Pasadena. In the late summer of 1936, scalding winds scoured the Southern California region. As the calendar reached September, the 16-year-old known as Junior couldn't shut off the voices now shouting inside his head. Preoccupied with the growing Nazi threat in Europe, day and night he roamed the sidewalks of Pasadena, the same ones that had carried him to grade school on his metal roller skates a decade before. Begging him to save the free world, the voices grew in intensity each day. Desperate to emerge with a plan, Junior continued his relentless pacing. This is Virgil Hinshaw Jr., my father. His father, Virgil Hinshaw Sr., had been chairman, they were all men back then, of the Prohibition National Party in the United States from 1912 to 24, and his legal behind-the-scenes work got the 18th Amendment passed. All 6 of his sons, later in his life, would regularly drink toasts to the prohibition work of their father, because they were all liberal Democrats and drinkers. Not everything is genetically transmitted. So this is a stern Pasadena home. When Dad was an early teen, 21st Amendment came in, his father decided to work for the international prohibition movement, and periodically visitors would come to LA for meetings of the international prohibition movement, and they'd come to the family dinner table for talks. And Dad told me years later that he remembered the visitors saying, so this was 33, 34, 35, the fascists have taken over Italy and Germany. You don't know, you isolationist Americans, what's really happening. And Dad said he was preoccupied with who would step up, who would save the world from the fascists. By the late days of August of 36, he was 16 and a half, about to start a senior year of high school, he became preoccupied, started to get about an hour of sleep a night, and his ideas about saving the world grew. As his thoughts gathered speed, an insight emerged. Alone among mankind, he had attained the power of flight. His arms, in fact, had become wings. Like Icarus, if he lifted them toward the sky, he'd be aloft. Once he soared toward the clouds, the free world's leaders would witness this magnificent signal and pledge to conquer the fascists. Alas, through his tortured logic, he reasoned that his flight would be seen around the globe only after sunrise. For now, he must await the dawn. As the early morning hours of September 6th inched toward dawn, the winds abated. Finally, a brilliant yellow-orange, the sun emerged to the east. Enthralled by his energy and his remarkable insights, Junior reached his block on North Oakland Avenue. Breathing in, he crossed his lawn with muted footsteps. All was silent in the early daylight. There was no turning back. The time was now. But how to ascend? Thinking fast, he nimbly scrambled up the trellis, steadying himself as he found footholds. A final thrust and he was on the roof above the small front porch, the walkway 12 feet below. The sky loomed majestically before him. The voices inside his mind reached a crescendo, pleading, save the free world. Glory would be his. Approaching the edge, he shed his clothes and heaved them over, shoes, pants, and shirt floating to the ground beneath. Suddenly cooler, he held his breath. Calf muscle straining, arms outflung, he pushed off and propelled himself forward. For a second, there was only the feel of the air against his skin. The ground rushed toward him before everything turned black. So that was my dad's flight to save the world from the fascists. It lasted just over a second. He landed on the sidewalk below the porch roof. His parents were out of town at a prohibition meeting. His three older brothers, two younger half-brothers rushed out. They hadn't seen him. He'd been up all night, wandering the streets for the past few nights. Got him shipped quickly to LA County Hospital in an ambulance, where he was diagnosed immediately with paranoid schizophrenia because he heard voices and was having delusional thoughts. The diagnosis of manic depression, or what's subsequently been called bipolar, was essentially not given in the US from about 1915 to 1970, once lithium was approved. LA County wouldn't hold a chronic psychiatric patient, so Dad was transferred to Norwalk County Hospital. Norwalk still exists. It's one of the 5 public mental hospitals left in all of California. It's got 3 different names by now. And this was an adult ward. There was no school. And what psychotropic medications did Dad get in the fall of 36? None. There were none. It was the next year that amphetamine salts were first used by Bradley to treat ADHD. It wasn't called ADHD then. And what psychotherapy did he get? Well, there weren't enough staff to provide psychotherapy. And what kind of family involvement? Well, none, because he was in a public locked ward. His roommates and bunkmates included, as he later told me, a number of men with microcephaly that you might get from contracting the Zika virus in utero, with very misshapen heads. And as my dad told me years later, it was then, son, that I had found my true identity as a deformed human being. In November, a couple of months into his stay, the superintendent called my grandfather and said, Mr. Hinshaw, you must get to the facility immediately. It's very dire with your son. He believes that the food has been poisoned by the fascists, and he stopped eating. He'll drink water. So Dad was admitted, going to play football, the old leather helmets, senior year, about 180 some pounds. And at that day of the call, he weighed 117, and the minister had been called in to deliver last rites. Not so much contact between a public mental hospital and a parent. My grandfather rushed over to see my dad, wrote a letter that night to his own brother saying, I believe I have seen my namesake, my fourth-born son, for the last time in this world tonight. Somehow, over the next months, the delusion lost its hold, Dad started eating again. By the end of February, the staff noticed that he had fairly spontaneously recovered and they released him back home to Pasadena. And so what was the outpatient family therapy follow-up? I won't be sarcastic. There was nothing. And the family, his father and stepmother, his own mother had died when he was 3, and his 3 older brothers and 2 younger half-brothers, decided that they probably shouldn't mention it because A, it might jinx his recovery, and B, it might be too embarrassing. So no one ever talked about it. He started 12th grade in early March, got all A's, made up the work from his fall semester, and life proceeded. He was valedictorian at Pasadena High. He went to Pasadena Junior College, as it was called then, was valedictorian there. Let's just see a picture. There's Dad graduating from Pasadena JC. He's 18 and a half, and he had a full scholarship to UC Berkeley. But he mailed the check back for $75 for the full year's tuition, room, and board, and decided to go to Stanford, which was a particularly bad decision because he was sane at the time. So they never quite forgave him that. So Dad did well at Stanford, graduated with honors. He should have been overseas then, soon after his graduation, to either in the Pacific or in Europe. But he was a 4F because he'd been 6 months at a public mental hospital. And some of his brothers, because their dad was a Quaker, were conscientious objectors. So he decided to pursue his passion of philosophy. He'd been a philosophy major at Stanford, and he got a fellowship to go to Princeton to earn his doctorate in philosophy. His first semester there, the department chairman, and again, they were all men then, said, we've arranged for the next semester and next fall, for the next year, a tutorial for you. That's kind of how grad school was back then, right? You didn't really choose courses, it was arranged. And you're to meet with a professor coming over from England at his home every Monday afternoon from 3 to 6 and have a one-on-one tutorial. And Dad said, well, who's that? And the chairman said, well, it's Bertrand Russell, so you'll be studying with Russell. Pretty good tutorial. His last year of grad school, the new chairman had come in and said, we've arranged for you to go across the street to the Institute for Advanced Studies and meet Professor Einstein. You're to get to know him and write a chapter on his social and moral philosophy. So Dad got to know Einstein. Einstein told him during one of their conversations that he never could balance his checkbook. He was terrible at math. And if you've read about Einstein, he failed grade school and junior high math. He was terrible. But obviously he had a different kind of mathematical ability. So I went to Harvard, as John's great introduction said. I went to UCLA. I always thought I had great mentors. But when Dad started to tell me, I thought, well, there's always in families a comparison. You never quite do as well as you think. But toward the end of his graduate career, he began to believe that he could predict the end of the war through telepathy. And he began to get paranoid again and not sleeping. And he went up to New York City. His girlfriend might have been leaving, and he banged on doors, and the police were called, and they shipped him, there was Trenton State, but they shipped him to Philadelphia State Hospital at Byberry. Byberry's now a suburb of Philadelphia. It was out in the countryside back then in the 40s. And he spent 6 months at Byberry in another, what we today probably diagnose as acute stage 2 or 3 mania, mixed state. He was beaten, as he reported in his journals that he kept, and I read obviously many years later, by fellow inmates and staff every week or a couple times a week in an occupational therapy room because he wasn't quite religious enough and he would make fun of the priest. He got there at Byberry his first insulin coma therapy, where you inject enough insulin to induce a grand mal seizure. One of his older brothers was working in Washington, D.C. as an economist and drove up every Sunday before freeways with a gas ration card to visit his little brother. And on one Sunday, his brother had apparently been doing better, and he got a day pass to take my dad out for lunch. But as soon as they left the parking lot, this massive parking lot of this big institution, Byberry, Dad started translating the road signs into German and then shouting in English, I'm at a concentration camp in Germany. My brother, you're my collaborator. Get me back before we're both shot. And my uncle, who was a quantitative economist, who would try to take notes every week and send them to the superintendent, get an early release for his brother, told me years later, well, I knew that day my progress notes weren't going to do so well. So reluctantly, he drove Dad back to the hospital. Dad got out about 5.5 months later, and then, again, many decades later, we started talking. I reflected to him on his belief that he'd been in a concentration camp. I also started, a couple of decades after that, researching The Mark of Shame, the book with the Bosch painting on the cover. And I found, in an incredible book by the medical historian Gerald Grob, called The Mad Among Us, A Social History of America's Mental Hospitals, a photographic essay of the new men's dorm unit at Bybear State Hospital, 1944-45. And I thought, boy, Dad was just there. Triple bunk beds, wall to wall with no windows, looked just like the Life magazine photographs of the liberation of the camps. Then I went to the website, the many websites that occurred 80s, 90s when the web started happening, about Byberry. It was the worst mental hospital in the United States. There were 7,000 men on this new dorm unit in space for 1,400. The photographs were smuggled out by actual conscientious objectors of the shallow graves and the starvations and beatings. So all of a sudden I realized that Dad's delusion that he was held in a concentration camp in Germany wasn't true, but there was some metaphorical truth to the goals by the time the snake pits had gotten to their total institution days and what some of the goals of the camps were. Gave me some respect for metaphorical truth versus literal truth. Got to move the story ahead. Dad gets out, again, sort of 6 months later, takes the train back to California, applies to become an assistant professor of philosophy because he'd had 4 single-authored papers on epistemology as a grad student. And Ohio State made him a good offer, so he flew to Columbus. And at the age of, how old was he? He started as an assistant professor just before his 25th birthday. He was going to have a great career in front of him. A couple years later, he met a grad student in history, my mother, on a blind date. They went out, fell in love, got engaged, and what did Dad tell Mom about his past during their courtship? Honey, I had a little trouble at Princeton and in high school, period. You would never tell your fiancé that you had chronic paranoid schizophrenia, which was his diagnosis, and had been in about a year in pretty tough mental hospitals. So when did Mom get it? When did she know what she was in for? During her pregnancy with me and her pregnancy with my sister. He wasn't around for my birth or my sister's birth. Both pregnancies precipitated fairly floridly stage 2, stage 3 manic and then mixed episodes. We know that women with a history of depression are at real risk for, during pregnancy and childbirth, postpartum depression. I mean, it's in the Times now, it's a national public health issue. Less well known is that men with a genetic vulnerability to bipolar disorder are at risk for episodes when their partner becomes pregnant. Harder to think of a hormone-based theory, right? The way it might be for postpartum depression. Existential fear of bringing someone into the world who's had your experiences. All through the 50s and 60s, Dad would disappear. 3 months, 6 months, at one point a year at a time, with these not very well controlled episodes. He wondered what to tell my sister and me as we got into the preschool years and grade school years. And his lead doctor, Ohio State trained, in Columbus said, in a talk I had with my dad, I'll never forget his expression, he said, Professor Hinshaw, if you ever tell your children about your mental illness, they'll be permanently destroyed. You and your wife are forbidden from ever mentioning the topic. So the doctor's order was complete silence. What do most kids do when something is obviously wrong in a household, but nobody talks about it? Well, I think there's 2 choices. You can believe, A, the world is a cruel, random, horrible place, not a very pleasant belief, or B, you can blame yourself. At least there's some control. So I saw my mom's looks, I knew not to ask, and I thought, gee, if I did ask, maybe Dad would never come back, or once he was back, if I talked about it, maybe he'd go away again. And so here we were in Columbus, Ohio. We had 50-yard line seats at Ohio Stadium when Woody Hayes was coaching the Buckeyes. This idyllic life, but there was a terror right underneath the surface. No one could talk about what was going on, and of course, if you don't talk about it, your fantasy is probably worse than any reality. I didn't know a lot of my childhood if my dad were dead or alive. What was it like? Let me read another passage, give you a little sense. First grade had ended. I noticed Dad wasn't home. The air outside was warm, the pavement baking in the noonday sun. I asked once or twice, but Mom said he'd return from his trip pretty soon, maybe a few more weeks. What trip? I inquired as softly as I could, but she said nothing more. One afternoon in the early summer, crossing the living room toward the back porch, I stopped short. Something seemed to be hovering nearby, though I couldn't quite figure out what. My skin grew cool. Soon my eyes were pulled upward as though by a magnet. With a start, I saw them, near the ceiling, a string of balloons. Incredulous, blinking, I looked outside to the porch, where another strand hovered over the backyard. All those different colors. Had there been a parade nearby? Maybe some kind of celebration? Limp and deathly still, their tight skins glistening, they floated there without a sound. As I continued staring, it dawned on me that the balloons were filled with poison gas. Hidden by their stretched plastic skins, the molecules inside were pressing for release. The danger was huge. Thoroughly frightened by now, I scurried upstairs to my bedroom. Was this a vision of some sort? To this day, I'm not certain. But I told myself back then that if I kept my eyes focused right in front of me, my gaze pointed straight ahead, I might never see them again. It's easier now, at my age, to say, what was the poison inside those balloons, this kind of weird vision I had? Well, that was the truth. Had to be contained. The stigma was the balloon skins, because if anything leaked out, we'd be destroyed. When did I learn what I've written about in this book, and what I'm telling you a little bit about today? Went off to college. I wasn't smart enough to apply to California for college, but I applied back east. I wanted to get away from kind of the mysterious home life we'd had. Back from Harvard for my first spring break, and Mom was over teaching. She was an English professor at Ohio State. My sister was in high school, and Dad, one afternoon, mid-April, pulled me inside his study with all his books and said, "Son, perhaps you should learn some events from my life." So during that first 40-minute talk, I learned about some of his hospitalizations and his diagnosis, and we talked 3 or 4 times a year whenever I was home or he was out east or in California for the rest of his life. So I went back that spring, that May and June, and changed my major to psychology and social relations. I thought maybe I should help solve mental illness, and I didn't think Dad had schizophrenia. I just couldn't quite figure it out. So I had a mission. But at the same time, I thought, if I can't sleep at night, my mind will probably unravel by dawn. And I couldn't talk to any girlfriends or roommates or anybody about what had happened. Professors, I wouldn't be fit to be a clinical psychology prospective student. So I lived in fear that I would probably be next. I mean, this was the 70s, and we knew then the Dana studies were coming out. Schizophrenia is transmitted genetically. Mednick, Schultzinger, all those classic studies in the late 60s, 70s. It took a long time for me. A few close friends, my sister, continued to talk with my dad, finally getting into therapy, and being able to dare talk about all this. Right out of college, I started to read a lot, and I thought, I don't think Dad has chronic paranoid schizophrenia. He must have this thing called manic depression, and I helped to diagnose him correctly, and he got on lithium. He'd been the 4th patient in the U.S. to get Thorazine, and back in '53, his older brother, who was a psychiatrist, got him on it. He'd had lots of ECTs that he probably didn't need back during the shock shop era, and finally on lithium, he had a few symptom-free years. Went on to grad school and decided to work with kids and families, and later, as I got a little more daring, take on Stigma. As a grad student, this might be the last passage I have time for, I spent 4 years at UCLA and then did an internship at what's now called the Semel Neuropsychiatric Institute, the good old NPI. And I took a rotation in the affective disorders clinic, and the director was a young professor named Kay Redfield Jameson. We'll lead off today's seminar with a question, stated Dr. Jameson from the head of the huge oval table. It's a thought experiment. Forthright, supportive, authoritative, and energetic, Jameson was a dream mentor and supervisor of mine during my year-long internship, blah, blah, blah. All 20 interns and psychiatry residents stopped their conversations. The clinic had become a top venue on the West Coast for patients with serious depression or difficult-to-treat forms of bipolar disorder. Jameson usually began by discussing a provocative new finding or sharing a clinical case. Why had she switched things up today? Project yourselves into the future, Jameson went on. Suppose you or your partner became pregnant. And there's a new screening test that can accurately detect the risk that the fetus will develop bipolar disorder. If Jameson didn't have my attention before, she did now. Even though the risk for manic depression, she continued, to emanate not from a single gene, but several in combination, and we now know hundreds in combination, the science might one day be able to detect risk with real precision. Assume that the screening test comes up positive. It's virtually certain, therefore, that your child will develop manic depressive illness. She had reached her conclusion. Here's the question for this thought experiment. Under this scenario, how many of you would elect to have an abortion for yourself or your partner? We'll take a vote. Raise your hand if you select the abortion given such a test result. For a second, the room went silent. A few trainees looked around sheepishly while others glanced down. One thing was sure, my hand would remain glued to the table. My arm, in fact, began to ache from pressing down so hard on the wood surface. But as I looked up, every hand in the room was held straight high. Every hand except for mine and that of my best friend, Jay Wagner, a fellow intern and fellow Midwestern survivor of a gifted yet troubled family. So, to cut off the passage, I started to reason, well, this is a tertiary care clinic. All the trainees and staff there are seeing the toughest cases on the West Coast, not easy to treat depression or bipolar. No wonder people are freaked out, but all that rationalization didn't really work. I had just witnessed the trainees of an elite facility vote 18-2 to have eliminated my dad from existence and our genes from the gene pool, if this is how it worked. So it was a big eye-opener for me about, even though I didn't use the term stigma at the time, back in the 80s as an intern, as to what the implications might be. So, we are running out of time, but let's look at a couple of pictures. 1923, outside of Chicago, where my dad grew up. This is in an international prohibition newsletter, and the title of the photo is The Motherless Hinshaw Boys, because their mother had died on the surgery table of an ovarian tumor and died during surgery a couple of months before. So on the right of the wagon is my Uncle Harold, Uncle Bud, 11 years old, very strong athletic kid who started to drink 2 years later, probably the son of a prohibitionist, the eldest son to start to drink, was probably not the coolest thing in the world, and he died in his 50s of choking on his own vomit from alcohol poisoning. So that's part of the family legacy. Over to the right, over to the left, sitting on the right of the wagon, is my Uncle Randall, who became the economist, who visited Dad at Byberry. There's Uncle Bob in the middle, he's just turned 5. He was the first one out of the house in Pasadena in '36, seeing his little brother, a year and a half younger, splayed on the sidewalk below, and told me, as I got to know him years later, that he decided within that year to become both a psychiatrist and a psychologist. And he did. He got an MD and a PhD, treated patients with mood disorders. He had migraines, like all the boys in this picture, and like me and my boys, and his migraines were very bad. When he got older and had his MD, he started prescribing himself pain pills, and then injecting, and then getting gangrene and losing his leg and dying of kidney failure, secondary to substance abuse. And then there's little Virgil Jr., 3.5. He's the only one in that picture who lost a parent between the age of 3 and 5. Is losing a parent to death a risk factor for later mood disorders, either unipolar or bipolar disorder? The answer is yes, but with a clear mediator and a clear moderator. The mediator is if your relationships with remaining family members and those outside the home continue to be supportive, the risk is dampened considerably. And the moderator is how old were you when you lost your parent? If you're an infant, the relative risk is hardly above 1. If you're in grade school or middle school, the relative risk is still low but significant. If you're between 3 and 5, the risk goes up astronomically. Something about not full attachment bonds, not full language. It's a particularly vulnerable time. My grandfather remarried a couple years later. This was the stern Quaker prohibitionist lawyer. My grandmother had been a missionary in South America. He married another missionary. It's called assortative mating. Screws up the genetics of things. And she was very stern too. She secured permission to punish and raise little Junior, because he was the youngest of the 4 before they had their own 2 boys. And so, as my dad later recounted and documented in journals, from about age 6 to 12, he was beaten with sticks and sexually abused by his stepmother. So, an obvious genetic loading. Loss of a parent between 3 and 5 and sexual and physical abuse is a very tough combination. And we'll talk about that in one of the closing slides. Here's Dad again. Let's do a little more of a genetic study with the 6 boys in the family. There's Uncle Harold over on the left. He'd been on the right of the wagon. He was a golf caddy. He didn't attain the academic prestige of the other boys because of his alcohol problems. There's Uncle Randall, slighter than the others, the economist, very anxious man, very kind man. There's Uncle Bob in the plaid shirt. He's just finished his MD and his PhD, started as a psychiatrist. There's my dad in the t-shirt. So those are the 4 boys. They're all in their 30s. The 2 boys on the left, or on the right, left in the picture, are my dad's 2 half-brothers. They're both in their 20s. They both have male pattern baldness, and the other older boys have full heads of dark hair. Sex-like trait. My Uncle Harvey in the sweater vest was found at age 4 to have perfect pitch. He became a concert pianist at Carnegie Hall and a professor of music. My Uncle Paul, over on the far right, had a beautiful baritone voice and was a soloist with the LA Master Chorale for 47 years. He just retired a few years ago in his 80s. Male pattern baldness, musical ability. Harvey in the sweater vest, firstborn son, Harvey Jr., was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder when he was 16 after he'd had somebody tie him up on a basketball hoop to depict the crucifixion of Christ and shot himself in the chest to his death when he was 31. Paul's oldest son, Marshall, started Berkeley in the 60s and is now in his 50th consecutive year of chronic schizophrenia. I bring him food every couple of weeks. His apartment is about as big as this podium up here. He's out of the hospitals. He has had unabated schizophrenia since the mid to late 60s. And when I was growing up, even before I knew what Dad's revelations told me, I knew that I had these cousins. I was the firstborn son of Virgil Jr., and my 2 cousins, the firstborn sons of Uncle Harvey and Uncle Paul, were both having severe psychiatric problems, but I didn't have anybody to talk with about it. College was not the most pleasurable, carefree time of my life. I worried all the time, but I had a mission. I was going to learn about psychology and maybe do something about it. Going forward, here we are on the beach near Santa Barbara. I'd just gotten my PhD. Dad and Mom were out. Mom took a picture of us. Dad is in his mid-60s, a full head of dark hair. Not everything is genetically transmitted. He's got a little bit of a paunch from the lithium that he had been successfully treated with, although kidneys weren't doing so well, so he had to go very low on the dose. And there I am. I had my mustache then, and when I met my wife sometime after that, she said famously, "Steve, the 70s ended a long time ago." So the mustache went soon after. Here is exactly 5.5 years later at Stinson Beach. I had my first visiting appointment at Berkeley. And if you can notice, Dad has started to stoop, and if it were a motion picture, you'd see the slow walking and the tremor. He'd begun the last 6 years of his life with a gradual onset Parkinson-like disorder. Only one other case of Parkinson and believe me, when I was in college, I studied family trees like crazy. Only one other case of Parkinson's. Parkinson's is quite interesting. The heritability of Parkinson's is very low, but that's how to lie with statistics. Across the general population, it's pretty low, but there's some families in which the heritability is 0.5 or 0.6 or 0.7, so it's a bimodal distribution. I can't help but think that being prescribed Thorazine by his older brother in '53 and having all of those ECTs probably weren't the best thing for his brain if only he'd been diagnosed correctly and treated correctly. Couple of lessons. Bipolar disorder has a heritability of 0.8 to 0.84. Genes predict enormously the risk. But if you've had loss of a parent between certain ages we talked about, and particularly if you've been physically or sexually abused, and there are the old post and leverage studies about this from the 80s and 90s, and very recent JAMA psychiatry reports of large samples of military individuals, the suicide rate, already high for bipolar, goes up precipitously. Earlier onset episodes, harder to treat episodes. So we're not talking about genes or experience, we're talking about both together. Intriguingly, in some of our own research, you never know what you're going to find until you do research, we have a large sample of girls with ADHD we followed into adulthood. Trait impulsivity. The girls were very impulsive when they were young, also a heritability of 0.75 to 0.8, have a high risk for self-harm by their early to mid-20s, but if they were also physically or sexually abused or received neglect when they were girls, the suicide risk by age 25 was 34%. Genes and environments summing together.
Completed suicide?
These were attempted suicide. There have been 2 completed, but not ideation, not NSSI, but serious attempt. During his very last couple of years, Dad and I continued our talks as his Parkinson's spread from the motor areas to the cognitive areas. His short-term memory wasn't good, but he still had a great memory for most of his life. One time we were talking in Southern California out by a pool, and he said, "Son, have I ever told you how much I wish I'd had cancer?" I thought, boy, Dad's having a breakthrough episode. What is he talking about? And he said, well, just think what the term mental illness means to a philosopher. If my illness were mental, I probably made it up. It was a figment of my imagination. How I long to have a real illness. I might have felt better about myself. And you know, son, he went on, every episode I had, I deserved. There was some moral failing. I hadn't shown enough faith. This is the dad in his 50s that I helped diagnose with bipolar disorder, sent him every article I could find from Kay Jamison's seminar, and at one level understood he had this biochemically based thing called bipolar disorder. But at another level, his identity had formed when he was 16 on the backboards. He was flawed, he deserved it. If your early experiences, and by early I mean through adolescence, aren't supportive of both psychoeducation and appropriate treatment, who knows what you'll believe, even if you're a professor of philosophy. What could or should Mom and Dad have told Sally and me when we were growing up? Probably anything was better than absolutely nothing. I want to highlight, and don't have time to go into it, a colleague and friend of mine is Bill Beardsley, Harvard Medical School, former chair of child psychiatry at Boston Children's Hospital, who developed a 16-session family therapy regimen back in the 80s and 90s. It's now been shortened to a much briefer thing, 6 sessions called Family Talk. And it was designed initially, in its longer version, for families in which one or both parents have either bipolar disorder or unipolar depression. The parents, one of the requirements is they need medication, they need psychotherapy individually, but the family therapy is predicated on getting the family to open up and talk to their kids about dad's drinking or mom's absences or the day the police came or the unemployment. And of course, what do most parents do in the middle of such therapy? Kids are out in the playroom, therapist says, we're going to start to work on this, and the parents say, what are you talking about? It's the most embarrassing thing ever. We'd never tell our kids this. And the therapist says, remember that consent form? You said, this is what we're doing. So kind of kicking and screaming, the parents are dragged through finding the language that kids can understand, be different for a 6-year-old girl and a 14-year-old boy. The kids come in for the last few weeks, and the parents, haltingly at first, start to talk about it. At the end of 16 weeks, this is in 2 tightly controlled randomized trials, the kids receiving this therapy have slightly better grades, better self-worth, better social skills. 4 years later, without additional treatment, their risk for depression themselves is cut by 35 to 40%. Mood disorders are transmitted genetically, and they're also transmitted, I think these randomized trials suggest strongly, by the absence of knowledge and this process of internalization. Talking about it matters. We've got a few minutes left. I could say a lot more, but I'd like to get any kind of discussion going. Thanks for your attention to this talk. Please.
Steve, thank you. Could you mention really quickly your high school groups that you were talking about at the beginning?
So this started a few years ago in Los Angeles as a program called LETS. Let's Erase the Stigma. Nice acronym of LETS, LETS. A guy flew up to Berkeley one day in 2010 who had been a Broadway dancer in Cats, a rock climber and a Wall Street investor. And he'd hurt his back, so he couldn't dance much anymore. And he sat in my office, and he said, I think I know how to stop stigma of mental illness. And I said, Bill, tell me more. No, we haven't figured this out. And he said, we start high school clubs. Club week. So the rugby club, the chess club, the Latin club, there still are Latin clubs. Or you could join the Let's Club. And this is a club that would be loosely guided, not a scripted therapy thing. High school advisor, no mental health professional, for kids to talk about their own and their family experiences and create their own curriculum, speakers coming in contact and compassion rather than knowledge. And so we did a quasi-experimental trial. Kids who were in these clubs didn't learn a lot about mental health because there wasn't a knowledge-based curriculum, but their attitudes and social distance and their actual behaviors intended to reduce stigma went up 0.6, 0.8 effect size. He lost his funding right at the time that I became a scientific advisor to Glenn Close's Bring Change to Mind, her anti-stigma organization. Bring Change to Mind kind of bought the rights to this Let's Erase the Stigma Club idea. We revised the guidebook. So we just finished a clinical trial in 50 high schools, 25 assigned randomly matched pairs, to get the club started in the fall of the year and another half delayed until the winter, looking for differential change. And we're seeking more funding to expand this out. Very interestingly, in this last clinical trial, we didn't have as much room to improve because the baseline scores were getting near ceiling. This is the advantage of social media. High school kids come in and say, well, why would you old people, why would you stigmatize mental illness? I see Instagram every day and people come out, and I think young people, as with gay marriage, are going to move the dial moving forward. Anybody else in our remaining moments? One at a time, it's hard to pick. Yes, Mark.
I'm curious about the difference between sort of, like it seems like we've had a big improvement in stated stigma, but not in activity, right? Can you give a sense of why that delta is so present and why it's getting harder?
So people know more because the facts about mental health are everywhere. But if you go into high schools and take over a health curriculum and teach the kids the facts about schizophrenia and depression, they learn more and are more stigmatizing at the end. Because it's like, oh, schizophrenia, those are the people who hear voices. People with depression want to take their lives, well, that's immoral. So I think it's much more, we've got to improve contact, but if your contact is seeing homeless people under the freeways, it's like the contact hypothesis, Pettigrew at Santa Cruz. It's contact under conditions of equality on equal footing in every day. So I'm not quite answering your question, but I think it's talking about it, having contact, and so it's going to take top-down structural approaches, bottom-up, and I think the media images still have to change a lot too, right? Yes, please.
How do you think that, for example, technology can advance this whole debate around stigma? I mean, can we develop apps that reward you socially, for example, if you talk or be nice to a homeless person or help someone with substance use disorder? Or what would be the mechanism to actually take this from there?
What I don't know about Instagram and Twitter, my 15-year-old's teaching me all the time. So I have a lot to learn. But I do have the distinct impression that as much as all the intents of social media is cutting into sleep and may precipitate depression in at-risk kids and all of those things that are debated in the journals now, the flip side and the positive side is a lot of kids, their natural empathy is enhanced by these images constantly crossing their attentional filters, if you will, of what's the big deal about people? Everybody's stressed. And so whether it's specific personalized apps or whether it's the right way to deliver that kind of social contact, I'm not sure, but I'd sure like to talk about it. Please.
One of the things you mentioned at the beginning is how kind of this public image of mental illness and gun violence in schools is problematic. I was curious if you have thoughts about ways to address that.
How much time do we have? I mean, I think in the interest of time, and people are going to their 1 o'clocks, I'd be glad to talk to you afterwards. We got a lot of work to do. One more? I saw one more hand. Yes?
Same question.
Same question.
You were trying to have let's with the kids at school, but now they're getting scared because they're hearing that these kids shooting them have mental illness potentially. So I think that,
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about that, but in the interest of time and not making people late for their 1 o'clocks, thanks again.